My first guest is on the front line, and he makes you proud to be British. He is the indefatigable Press TV correspondent on the front line in Ukraine. That's right, he's Johnny Miller. Johnny, welcome to the show. I'm a big admirer of your work. I want to talk to you later about the difficulties of finding you on Twitter. You're clearly shadow banned. I couldn't even tag you on Twitter, so I want you to tell everyone towards the end of this interview how they can follow your work, which is truly outstanding. But you outdid even your own previous high standards by a very special interview that you have just published. It is an interview with the young woman who was supposedly shelled by the Russians whilst giving birth, except the story was rather different. Tell us.
Well, yes, so this is a famous picture that was broadcast all around the world of a woman who supposedly was shelled by a Russian airstrike. Now, I don't know whether it was a Russian airstrike or Russian artillery or something else, but this photo of her was broadcast all around the world. Interestingly, most of the Western media didn't interview her and ask her thoughts. I found her recently in Makiivka, the adjoining cities Donetsk, where I am now, and interviewed her and talked to her. And what she said was very interesting. She said that she was misrepresented by the two Ukrainian journalists working for a Western outlet. Turns out that she is essentially pro-Russian. She's not critical at all of the Russian military, and instead she blames the Ukrainian army for what's been happening here in Donbas. She's lived in Makiivka, not far from where I am now, for all life. She's been born here. She's lived under Ukrainian shelling. And instead of criticizing the Russian army, she's been criticizing the Ukrainian army for bombing Donbas civilians for the last 8 years. And it's interestingly that a picture of this woman who's pregnant, leaving a hospital in Mariupol, has no criticism of the Russian army, doesn't hate Russia. She's a proud Russian citizen, and instead she blames Ukraine. This is an exceptional example of an innocent civilian being used for propaganda purposes. Of course, millions of people in the West, that picture was used to inspire hatred of Russia. And it turns out she doesn't hate Russia at all. She's living here happily under Russian rule. It reminds me of the famous picture of Omran, if you remember that, in Syria, the picture of that child in the back of an ambulance. Interestingly, I was in Syria at that time when Syrian forces recaptured that area. And I spoke to the father with the child Omran sitting on his lap, who said he has no criticism of the Syrian government. So this is another example of an innocent civilian being used to promote hatred of a so-called enemy state of the West. And it turns out the civilian in that picture doesn't hate that government at all. So it's a fascinating story. And interviewing her, she's very happy being here. A fascinating story about how propaganda is used, innocent civilians are used to promote hatred of certain governments. And it turns out that that photo has a very different story behind it.
Johnny, that's a great example of how stories are shown but are entirely distorted. In this case, reversed. A reverse image is used. On the other hand, I've seen, I hope no people of tender sensibilities has seen the video shot by the Ukrainian forces this week of them murdering prisoners of war lying face down on the ground. That doesn't get shown anywhere. There's an example of propaganda by omission. This is an extraordinary war at a time when we've got more journalists, more technology, more ability to capture and broadcast what is actually happening in a war than we have ever had, and yet we have virtually no real footage of this war, and that which we do is oftentimes a lie.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'll tell you something interesting, George. I mean, I have a contact with the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You can believe him or not, but he says that not a single British or American media outlet has even applied to come to Donbas or Russian-held Ukraine. There have been French, there have been German, there have been Italian mainstream journalists here. I know that, I've met them. They've been allowed in. The BBC has a correspondent in Moscow. The Russians are allowing mainstream journalists in Moscow. But it's interesting what he told me, that not a single British and American media outlet have even applied to come here. And the reason that they haven't applied, if that's true, or they haven't come, is because there are many honest mainstream journalists, to be honest. I've met some of them, fantastic people. But if you're a mainstream journalist, if you're any kind of journalist, here where I am right now in Donetsk, you've got no choice but to report some very uncomfortable, inconvenient facts. Every day when I walk out of my apartment here in Donetsk, I worry about getting blown up. I was here for a month. I had to leave. I had lines all over my face. I look 10 years older because it's just how dangerous it is here. I had breakfast with my translator, a local woman with a 2-year-old child 2 days ago. She sat down on the couch next to me. I said, "How are you?" She said, "We got bombed last night. My local school was bombed." She had a 2-year-old child lying beside her. Her body convulsed with every explosion. I went there. It was her school. It was a school that she went to school at. It was bombed. That's the danger. I've been here for months, on and off. I've been to the hospitals, the schools, the markets. I've seen the bodies in the street. You go to I'll tell you one story. I went to it was a fellow journalist's birthday at a local restaurant. We had just a local a meal at a local restaurant. I popped by a bus station, which I heard was bombed earlier. Bodies lying in the street. Turned up to the restaurant, told the journalists. They just shrugged. It's just another day in Donetsk. Ukraine has been bombing civilians here for the last 8 years. And that's why Western journalists, I'm almost the only Western journalist here in Russian-held Ukraine. There's a few other fantastic independent journalists who are here on and off. But mainstream reporters don't come here because they would have no choice but simply to report the truth. They can't lie that much. And the truth is that Ukraine has been bombing civilians here for the last 8 years. And the vast majority of people here support Russia. And of course, that's a very inconvenient fact, because while the mainstream media is promoting constant war here, they say there's no chance of peace unless Putin leaves, unless Russia leaves. They don't want you to know that Ukraine is also, this is also a civil war in a sense. The root is a civil war. Now it's become a proxy war. But it's a civil war between Ukrainian ultra-nationalists and its pro-Russian population, which are mainly in the east and the south. And if people in Europe, people in Britain realize that, they would realize there is a peace to be had and new borders to be drawn. So reporters don't come to where I am now because they don't want you to know the truth. The Ukraine has been bombing people here for 8 months, and that the vast majority of people here support Russia. That's why I'm pretty much the only Western reporter here, because they simply don't want you to know these simple facts.
Well, of course, the eagle-eyed will have noticed already that whilst the BBC can operate in Moscow, Russian television cannot operate in London. And in fact, anyone, whether a Russian or a British citizen, working for any Russian media would be committing a criminal offense for which they could go to prison for 7 years. Russia allows the BBC freely to operate and propagandize in Moscow and would allow them to go to the war zone if they wanted to cover the war, but they do not, and as you say, have not even applied. But there was one British fellow working there a few months ago. I forget his name, but I'd never seen any of his work. But the British government seized his house in England, confiscated it, because they didn't like his reporting from a war. You couldn't make it up, Johnny.
Well, unfortunately, George, you seem shocked and astounded by that, and quite rightly. But I've been working here months, and I'm not shocked and astounded. And it's very serious here. As I said, I'm one of the only Western reporters here. And I won't lie to you, it's very worrying. Almost every Western reporter here has either been sanctioned, as you say, or facing imprisonment. A friend of mine, German journalist Alina Lipp, I don't know about you, if you know her story, she's been threatened with 3 years imprisonment in Germany. Recently, I did a story in Crimea. Her mother has recently fled to Crimea. Why? Because she's been sanctioned by the German government. She's a lovely old woman. She's a spiritual healer. She works with handicapped children. She's a lovely woman. We had a lovely stroll around some gardens there. She's just a normal, lovely woman. She went to the German. She's been sanctioned by the German government. They closed her bank account. She went to her bank manager, and you know what they told her? They said, "Well, maybe you can go to the church. Maybe the church will help you." This is a European citizen who's had their bank account closed, and she has. What can you do? She's told me you can't buy food, you can't pay your rent. This is the mother of a journalist. The German government, to get to Lena Lip, who's simply been reporting the truth here, she simply said that Ukraine has been killed. I've seen the court documents. She said that Ukraine has been killing people here for 8 years, and the majority of people here support Russia. These are two undeniable facts. And yet the German government is threatening her with 3 years in jail. And now they've sanctioned her mother and her father. And now, as you say, a British journalist has been sanctioned. There's a French journalist who was an eyewitness at what happened at Butcher, criticizing the narrative around Butcher. He faced an assassination attempt in Turkey. He used the SBU. And for the few Western journalists who are here, George, I'm not going to lie to you. It's seriously worrying. I may well be sanctioned. I may well face imprisonment. I may well face assassination. I'm on a Ukrainian hit list, Vedets. I'm not sure if you know about that. And this increasing war between the East and the West, any journalist who threatens it, of course, Julian Assange is in jail, as we know. Any journalist increasingly who steps over a line is in serious threat of imprisonment, sanctionment, or assassination. That's the reality we're now moving into, George.
Johnny, how can people see your work? How can they follow you? How can they support you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've recently started doing a lot more social media. So you can follow me on Twitter. I think Johnny Mills is the tag on Press TV, of course, and on Telegram as well. But really, I think, increasingly, I heard you speaking before about this missile attack in Poland. Now, as a journalist here, as a correspondent, I have to report on the whole of Ukraine, and the news desk often asks me to comment on the whole of Ukraine. I often look at mainstream sources who have many journalists in the west of Ukraine. I'm increasingly thinking these sources are not credible. Recently, Western media reporting that Russia had attacked Poland. It wasn't, it was Ukraine with these missiles. And so increasingly, I'd ask also people to look out for independent journalists, for the journalists who are here, because fantastic other journalists here who are reporting some fantastic stuff as well.
Were you aware of how close we came with this entire hoax over the so-called attack on Poland? Because here, people couldn't get to sleep that night, including me, because the media went completely insane. And all the next day, by which time the story had been entirely debunked, to be fair, by President Biden, talking in Bali, in which in the middle of the night he said, no, it's very unlikely that it was a Russian missile. But by that time, all the British papers had been published. And so for a whole day, you had to go into the supermarket and see every front page talking about a Russian missile attack on a NATO member, which never was. Did you catch the sense of how dangerous a moment that was?
Well, here in Donetsk, you're under shelling all the time. So people are worried about their own things here. But I did get that sense, yeah. And this is why, one of the reasons you're increasingly hearing people in the mainstream or former mainstream, a former head of the French army recently came out and said, this war is not in European interests. Even the former British general said, we need to promote peace here. Increasingly people who are retired start saying that this war is not in European interests. You've got the extremist element in Ukraine is not just Russian propaganda, it's serious. And NATO are not going to be able to control these extremists. So the threat of this war turning into a world war, or NATO, Russia, Zaporozhye nuclear plant has recently been bombed again by Ukraine. So when you're arming extremists in Ukraine, there's a very real threat of it getting out of hand. And that's why increasingly you're seeing mainstream figures in Germany, in Europe, often retired figures who are no longer beholden to the party line, saying that this war particularly is not in European interests, but our media continues to promote, which is in a few people in the American State Department's interests, very much an American war here in Ukraine. But increasingly, you're seeing European mainstream figures, not just rebel journalists or speakers like you and me, George, but increasingly mainstream figures in Europe saying that this war is not in European interests, and the threat of this turning into a world war is one of the reasons for that.
Johnny Miller, may God preserve you. Take care, my friend. Watch how you go. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.